Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor and I'm a Sony Digital Imaging Ambassador. Now, choosing a telephoto lens can be a difficult decision to make because any choice will include a compromise or two. Now, the one with the most reach on my left is the new 400-800 lens, and that might be enough for many people to want to choose this particular lens because you don't necessarily need to switch out teleconverters to get extra reach, which the other three lenses on the table do require that you make those decisions. Now, if you're looking for a really lightweight lens, then the one on my extreme left, the 100-400 GM with teleconverters, may be the lens to go for, simply because you could entertain the idea of putting this in a messenger bag rather than a backpack. If you want flexibility but an ultra-wide aperture, then you might choose one of Sony's ultra-wide aperture primes such as the 300 or 400 GM lenses, but you'd still need to use teleconverters to push out to that 800mm reach. This brings me to the lens closest to me, which is the new 400-800. It does have a maximum aperture of f8 at the 800mm reach, but this is not the problem that it used to be some years ago. Because of AI noise reduction software, and we get plenty of shallow depth of field at an 800mm focal length, don't be put off by this f8 maximum aperture. Take a deeper dive into this video review and see whether this lens is something that you could possibly choose as your telephoto lens of choice. Hi and welcome to my review of Sony's FE400-800 telephoto zoom lens. Now this is more of a telephoto lens choice video rather than trying to persuade you to buy the 400-800 version. Even if we could afford to purchase all of the white telephoto lenses, we possibly wouldn't want to carry more than one or two of these super zoom lenses. Now, if you're interested in the 400-800, you're possibly interested in that additional reach above and beyond what is offered by the 200-600 G lens. Now, the 400-800 offers a third more reach than the 600mm focal length. There are, however, more ways to achieve that additional reach, so I feel obliged to be able to mention these so you can consider your options. One is the ability to crop tighter when editing, and this obviously is afforded with the higher resolution sensors. And the second option is to use teleconverters. There is actually a third option, and that is to try and physically get closer to the subjects that you're photographing, but I'll leave that one out of the equation for this video. Now, a third more reach. How do we achieve that using a higher resolution sensor? Simply move up from your 24 megapixel sensor to a camera that's carrying one of the 33 megapixel sensors. We can also get that third more reach by maybe coming from 33 to 42 megapixels or from 42 to 60 megapixels. 1.4 teleconverters adds 40% more reach, so you're going to get even more reach by considering using that 1.4 times teleconverter. Just to highlight this was captured with an Alpha 7 IV with a 33 megapixel sensor. Now, if we're shooting in APS-C, the crop mode on that camera, you can see how much more we punch in to get closer to that subject. And there's plenty of resolution left over when using these 33 megapixel sensors, because if I put an overlay of the 4K resolution, and that's what most people need to fill their humongous 4K screens, you can see we can crop again even if we've shot in APS-C mode. We can alternatively just shoot full frame and then do a 2 times crop in post-production, and with an addition of a 1.4 times teleconverter we can make a 70-200 look like it's got a 560mm full frame equivalent angle of view. It gets even better when we're using the 50 or 60 megapixel sensors. There's the 4K overlay over a crop that I've captured of this particular eagle at a wildlife sanctuary, and that is giving my 135 lens a 300mm full frame equivalent angle of view. Here we are looking at a sporting context image, and there you see on the inset image is that red box is the 4K overlay dimensions. That's 3840 pixels wide by 2160 pixels high, and you can see if you're using very good glass you can crop in that tightly and still have very rich sharp detail to spare. If you were looking for that more reach and you've moved beyond that 100, 400, even using teleconverters, then obviously you're looking at either Sony's 200, 600 or this new 400 to 800 G lens. This does require you rethink how you carry your camera lens combinations. So I feel obliged to also mention that carrying these big lenses around is something that you need to consider. For instance, I like working out of 7L and 10L messenger bags, but when I am working with one of my big telephoto lenses or one of the big 400 prime lenses, I do have to move over to using a backpack rather than a messenger bag. So this is definitely something worth factoring in if you're thinking of making this move. I should mention that when we're carrying these big lens camera combinations around, we're mounting the camera strap to the lens and not the camera body. This takes the strain off the E mount that we're looking at there. So these big lenses do offer lugs on the side of the lens to be able to mount your maybe Peak Design clips that you can attach to your Peak Design strap. Now, I actually prefer to actually mount the attachment point to the foot of the lens. This means that when I'm walking around with this big lens camera combination, the camera sits snugly against my body, hanging horizontally rather than vertically. This is just a personal preference, but something that I thought I would add into this video. The FE400 to 800 is a little longer and a little heavier than the 200-600, and some people already think that 200-600 is quite a big lens and does cause some pause for thought when making this purchase. With the new 400 to 800, the tripod mount is fixed and reinforced. It's obviously carrying now a big lens, and so they don't think you're going to want to quickly detach these lens foots from the lens. It is possible to remove the foot by undoing some screws, but generally it is not a quick operation anymore. On the new lens, we have added full-time DMF. This is a very useful feature if you need to assist the camera lens combination in finding focus, even when you're in AF or continuous autofocus. That DMF really helps you to pull focus really quickly and let the autofocus re-engage. So that's a good new addition over and above the 200-600. This also is a feature that is on the latest model cameras as well. So you don't actually need it on these lenses if you have a late model camera. Now, one of the good things they've retained from that 200-600 is the third SteadyShot mode. So when your subjects are moving very erratically, you move from mode 2, which is generally assigned when panning the camera, to mode 3 when the movements are very erratic, i.e. they include panning horizontally but also vertical movements as well. Let's take a look at the 200-600 alongside the 400-800. Now I'm adding that 1.4 teleconverter to look at the size of the 200-600 with the 1.4 teleconverter, and also factoring in the additional weight of carrying that teleconverter, because this is what some people may consider or are currently doing, is they're using teleconverters with their existing white telephoto lenses. So it's just a little bit longer and a little bit heavier, as we can see. If we're adding teleconverters to one of our previous white telephoto lenses, we do have to factor in the cost of this. They're not particularly large, so they don't take up a huge amount of room in your camera bag, but at $550 each, then that is definitely need to be factored into the purchase price when considering the 400-800, which you may be able to use without teleconverters, and maybe in comparison to a 200-600 or a 100-400 with those teleconverters. Let's take a look at some of these statistics. It's 6% heavier than the FE200-600 when using that in conjunction with the 1.4 teleconverters, and it's 3% longer than the 200-600 with that same 1.4 teleconverters. So we're looking at an f8 maximum aperture at 800 millimeters with the 400-800 instead of a maximum aperture of f9 when using the 200-600 with 1.4 times teleconverter, although that does give you a reach of 840 millimeters. So there's a little bit of swings and roundabouts there. Note this new lens from Sony is a little bit heavier than Canon's 200-800 lens, but that Canon lens does not feature internal zoom, and it does have a maximum aperture at 800mm of f9. So this Sony lens does have some advantages over that Canon. Not that you could consider purchasing the Canon anyway, because you can't adapt it to the Sony body. Let's take a look at the 200-600 using a 1.4 teleconverter to get that 840mm reach at f9. Now, I'm more than happy with the quality of sharp focus and fine detail that renders when using the 1.4 times teleconverter. So this is something to consider when making this decision. And as you can see from this zoomed in, where I've gone 100% magnification on this Gorilla, we do get rich fine detail. Now, it may not be quite as sharp as the 400-800, but it is acceptably sharp for many photographers. Let's talk about that f8 aperture. I've seen some forums on some of the, say, Sony Alpha Rumor forums where people are saying, well, I could never consider a lens with a maximum aperture of f8. I have to admit to not quite fully understanding the reservations about this f8 aperture. For instance, if we had a maximum aperture of f5.6 on this lens, the lens would be absolutely humongous, and perhaps no one would buy such a heavy big lens. Let's take a look at the 200-600 at the 600mm with that 1.4 times teleconverter, giving us a maximum reach of 840mm. We have to apply that teleconverter factors to the maximum aperture, so we do lose one stop. So the maximum aperture comes down from f6.3 to f9. If we were using a 2 times teleconverter on the 400 G Master Prime lens, we could also hit that 800mm reach, and we could benefit from then a maximum aperture of f5.6, a loss of 2 stops from the maximum f2.8 aperture. But that comes at some considerable cost, because we're looking at an outlay of over $12,500 there. I'm going to take a comparison with Sony's competing lenses. Obviously, the competing lenses do have to factor in the use of either 1.4 times teleconverters or 2 times teleconverters in order to get that 800mm reach. The 200-600 certainly has some advantages for price, including the 1.4 times teleconverter. The 100-400 is now working with a maximum aperture of f11, so that's a bit of a down point on that one, but it does have the advantage of being the lightest combination, the smallest and lightest combination there, and the price point isn't too bad. The 400 f2.8 G Master Prime has the advantage of the f5.6 aperture. Alternatively, we could use the 600mm prime with a 1.4 times teleconverter and also take advantage of that f5.6 maximum aperture. Downsides of those choices is cost and also physical size and weight, especially for that 600mm option there. Now let's bring in the new 400-800 G lens for comparison. You'll see that f8 aperture is not too bad, considering we'd have to spend significantly more money in order to get a wider f5.6 aperture by using one of the 400 or 600 G Master Prime lenses. You'll also see that minimum focusing distance I'm listing there is not too bad, and I'm going to be looking at that in some depth as we go through this review. Let's take a look at some of the specs. It's got internal zoom, internal focus. It can keep up with the 120 or 240 frames per second tracking of an Alpha 9.3. It's got a linear response manual focus. It's got suppressed focus breathing, 11 circular aperture blades for improved bokeh. It's got 6 ED Super ED glass elements to limit chromatic aberrations, and we'll see that's also quite effective as I review this lens. And it's got that 5.45 pounds or shade under 2.5 kilograms there. So let's take a deeper dive into the 400-800mm lens now. F8 noise. Some people looking at that F will go, well, surely I'm going to pay a penalty of noise when getting that extra reach if my maximum aperture is only F8. So I did head up this video with one of these images of this bird shot at almost eye level to the bird to get that nice shallow depth of field here. Now you can see this image was actually processed from a very high ISO file. And that's one of the reasons that an f8 aperture is not the penalty it used to be just a couple of years ago, because we have some excellent denoising software now available to us. So if you're looking at a lot of image noise, we can apply Adobe's denoising or DxO denoise technologies in order to get absolutely clean images with beautiful fine detail retained. My personal favourite there is the DxO Pure Raw, which can be bought as a standalone software or as a plug-in for Lightroom. It's also the same technologies that DxO use in their Photo Lab software there. So this one is actually captured at ISO 25600, but has been through those denoising processes using that DxO software. And again, you can see beautiful fine detail even at these elevated ISOs, because this particular gorilla is sitting in deep shade, and because I'm also using quite a fast shutter speed to avoid any possible camera shake, you can see that it's not the problem that it used to be when shooting with f8 apertures. So let's take a look at DxO Pure Raw just briefly, because many of the examples in this review have been processed using DxO Pure Raw. So this is a tawny frogmouth, and I'm just going to zoom into 100%. That red bounding box on the right shows the zoomed area on the left there. And this is at ISO 6400, clean as a whistle, beautiful fine detail in the feathers just to the top of the beak there. Now here's a before and after, before DxO processes the noise in this image, and on the right side of that split in the screen you can see also the processing that has been applied to this. Obviously with the fit-in screen view, a lot of people are more accepting of those high ISO values, but if you are cropping tightly, then those denoising technologies are going to be your friend when working with a maximum aperture of f8. And there's the before and after. Before on the left, before any denoising, and on the right using DxO Deep Prime for the This noise reduction becomes especially important when we're going to crop tightly on our images, because effectively as you crop tighter you're zooming in on that level of noise. So this one is quite a tight crop, a 1.8 times crop from my Alpha 1 sensor, and we're using a high ISO of 25600. And this is what it looks like after DxO Pure Raw has been over this image. Plenty of fine detail even on this very tight crop with not a hint of any noise. Now one of the reasons you are going to get quite high ISOs on these files is, especially when you're shooting birds in flight at shutter speeds of 1/2000th of a second and faster, you are going to be looking at 4-digit ISO values even on a sunny day. So this goes hand in hand, is you are going to be using denoising with lenses that were basically stopped down to f8. So let's take a look at that birds in flight using the new 400-800. So I'm tracking the bird in flight at 600 millimeters, and because it is a bright day and I'm more than happy to use an ISO value of 2500, I've actually increased the shutter speed to 1/4000th of a second. And if we zoom into 100% magnification after the denoising has been applied, you can see, yes, this lens can track birds in flight, no issues whatsoever. It does have some excellent XT linear focus motors there. So this is an uncropped image. Again, this bird carrying some foliage away, perhaps to its nest, and we're looking at the 100% magnified view now, again at ISO 2500 after the denoising has been applied, and some beautiful fine detail. I'm going to give this a tick of approval for birds in flight. If you are thinking about purchasing this lens and you're definitely wanting to shoot birds in flight, then I've got no hesitation in saying this lens is capable of the job. Let's take a closer look to see the level of sharpness we can achieve when using this 400-800 G lens. Now I'm comparing it with the 100-400 using a 2x teleconverter on the left, and on the right we have the 400-800 without teleconverters, and we're shooting at a focal length of 800 millimeters. Now we are tracking out to quite a considerable distance as well. We're not shooting something that's very close to us. So we're really testing the capability of sharpness now with this particular lens. Now I'm typically very happy to recommend the 1.4 times teleconverter. I think I get a good level of sharpness when using the 1.4 times on all of Sony's wide telephoto lenses. The 2 times teleconverter, however, is a little bit more difficult to recommend for all users because some users will notice a noticeable loss of sharp or fine detail when working with the 2 times teleconverter and either cropping tightly or zooming into 100% in their post-production editing software. Now this is the fit-in view, and you'll probably see very little difference if you're watching this in 4K on a large monitor. You'll probably see very little differences between the two. But as I zoom to 50% magnification, the image on the right, the new 400-800, starts to look noticeably sharper. And this really comes into its own when we now zoom into 100% magnification. And quite clearly now we can see the 400-800 is significantly sharper than the 100-400 with 2 times teleconverter. I'm more than happy with the level of fine detail that we're seeing in the image on the right there now. Just moving over to a different area of the image, and you can see maybe on the grills of the air conditioning unit where each line is quite clearly separated from its neighbor. So we're getting good levels of sharpness with the new 400-800. So if sharpness is your thing, you're obviously going to consider the new 400-800 without teleconverters over maybe the 100-400. Now it might be a little bit of a different story with the 200-600 using a 1.4 times teleconverter. The differences will not be as significant as what I'm showing you now. I do own a 2 times teleconverter, and I do use the 2 times teleconverter, and I have to say that I'm more than happy recommending the 2 times teleconverter on Sony's 300mm G Master Prime. So this is at 1:1 magnification, and we can see there is no loss of fine detail when using the 2 times teleconverter on this particular lens. Here's another example using the 2 times teleconverter. Let's punch into 100% magnification. No one is going to be complaining about the level of fine detail when we see the 2 times in conjunction with the 300 G Master Prime. So this is something that I'll get back to right at the end of this review, because the 300 with the teleconverters is one of my firm favorites when shooting wildlife. We do, however, have a maximum reach of 600, and we've obviously got 400-800 on this new lens. Again, putting this into a real-world context for wildlife shooters, here I am at the 800mm focal length. We're cropping in with a 1.5 times crop in post-production, but this would be the same results if you use the APS-C mode. So we're getting a 1200mm full frame equivalent angle of view without using teleconverters. As I enlarge this image so you can see it full screen, you can see even with that 1.5 times crop at the 800mm focal length, we're rendering good amounts of fine detail in the feathers of this particular small bird. And if I do a 2 times crop in post-production, okay, you can see it still hangs on to that fine detail. Most people are going to be more than happy with the sharpness of this lens at the longer reaches of focal length. Atmospheric conditions and long focal lengths. I do need to point out that some people might buy this lens, start shooting, and then notice that things aren't quite as sharp as they expected them to be. And this may not be an issue with the lens, it might be something to do with the atmospheric conditions that you might be shooting with on that particular day. So here's a view of the Melbourne city here. I've just put that little red box because I'm going to zoom in to 800mm. And this is going to be an uncropped image I'm going to show you that with good atmospheric conditions we don't get any loss of sharpness, and so you're going to get beautiful fine detail if the air quality is quite dry and we're not punching through huge amounts of ultraviolet light. We're working at a distance from the city of perhaps 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers, but again, 100% magnifications on these will reveal beautiful fine detail, just simply because the air quality is very good on this particular day. Now, if I turn the lens around 180 degrees and start shooting away from the city and out over the bay, you can see the air quality is not so good over the bay on this particular day because there's a little bit of wind, and this wind is creating some salt air to be kicked up. And so when we zoom into 100%, you'll see that we have no fine detail. This is actually on the same day, just pointing the lens in different directions. And so air quality is a big factor in working out whether we can work at a great distance with this particular lens. So my rule of thumb is always try to get as close as possible and don't use the long telephoto reaches if you can physically get closer to your subjects. So my words of recommendation is to close the gap if and when possible, and only use those 800mm focal lengths when you absolutely have to. And of course, you often have to when your wildlife that you're photographing is exceptionally small. Perhaps you're not on an African safari shooting the elephants and the giraffes and the zebras. You're actually photographing these much smaller wildlife such as lizards or small birds. And this is really where the 800mm focal length of this zoom really comes into its own. I'm still trying to get as close as possible, and that minimum focusing distance is coming into its own now. In fact, it's got a good minimum focusing distance. Also, we're reducing the depth of field. Some people might be nervous of f8, thinking, well, I'm not going to get my shallow depth of field that I'm used to with using my f2.8 apertures. But of course, when you increase the focal length of the lens, you also decrease the depth of field. Just to show you the depth of field in real world terms again, especially with birds, is this, all of these are going to be maximum aperture of f8 or at best f6.3 at the 400 to 500mm focal lengths. So this is f8, and you can see we've got some glorious out of focus areas in the background. This is moving water behind the bird, and this gives me a beautiful figure ground separation with some very interesting bokeh in the background. Different bird, but again, that same moving water is no one is going to be saying, oh, I don't have enough depth of field in these particular shots, because the depth of field is just what we want for these type of shots, and again captured at f8. So some more examples, f8 again, and even though that background might be a little bit distracting if we're using a shorter focal length at f8, but because we're using a long reach 800mm at f8, it's great for figure ground separation. In this one, I can't even make out what is in the background, and again we're working this time with f9. I've stopped down a third of a stop just to ensure I've got complete focus over the entire bird's head there. This one is at a shorter focal length, f6.3, but still very good shallow depth of field. And again, 400mm, f6.3. I'll put there not too dissimilar when comparing it to a 70-200 at the 200mm working at the maximum f2.8 aperture. So if you're already owning a 70-200 lens 2.8, then you're not going to be disappointed with the depth of field that you're achieving with this particular lens. In fact, you're probably wanting to do a little happy dance when you see that you're not disappointed with the depth of field. So just trying to zoom in now, 423mm, now 528mm. Now the maximum aperture is now starting to reduce, so the maximum aperture is now f7.1. And as we zoom even more, 641mm, we hit the f8. Now you notice actually that the depth of field is actually getting shallower even though the aperture is closing down as we use longer focal lengths. Now, one of the ways that I make sure that I've got very shallow depth of field is, if I can, I will get down on the ground and shoot so that the background is much further away from the subject that I'm photographing. Rather than shooting down where I get more of the grass in sharp focus, I'm shooting across the grass so both the foreground and background is well out of focus at these long focal length lenses. So here we are with one of those hero shots, 710mm with this bird searching for his insect or worm. Now the background is a little bit closer in this particular instance of this black swan that I'm photographing now, But even so, we still get good figure ground separation because we are working with quite shallow depth of field. You can see the feathers on the swan's body there are not in sharp focus. So we do still have very shallow depth of field, even when the background is a little bit closer to your subject. So I think these are nice shots where we get some reeds in sharp focus and the reeds behind the bird out of focus here. And where I've just come in for a tighter head and shoulder shot there. Well, can't see the shoulders because of such a long neck, but we're still getting good figure ground separation to make that subject pop. SteadyShot. Now, the SteadyShot on the new latest model cameras is absolutely excellent, and you'll find that you'll be going down to shutter speeds maybe as low as 1/60th of a second, even at the 800mm focal length. If you're on SteadyShot mode 1, you should be able to do this. Most of the subjects I was photographing in this particular review period are moving, however. So for most of the images, I didn't go below 1/250th of a second. So this is a moving hot air balloon captured at that slightly slower shutter speed. No issues that I'm shooting below, say, 1/800th of a second at 800mm. I'm still confident that I can get these shots sharp and keep the ISO as low as I can, even though I'm not too worried about the high ISOs with the software I now have available to me. So I shot these pre-dawn shots with these hot air balloons coming over Port Melbourne at these 1/250th of a second slower shutter speeds there. More than happy with the fine detail of all of these shots. Close focusing. Now, we did mention this was quite a good feature for this lens, perhaps not quite as good as the 100-400, which makes an excellent close focusing lens, but I think this has close focusing capability enough in the fact that we can put small birds full frame. In fact, I can't even fit the lizard in this image of this particular lizard, who's collected a lot of the pond foliage as he's been coming through the water there. So we're looking at a close focusing capability of 1.7 meters or 5.58 feet at the 400mm focal length there. Looking at a tight head and shoulders shot of a gull here. So again, the fact that I can get in and render the beak completely out of focus and the eyes pin sharp, I think is a close focusing capability enough. It will not disappoint. And this is quite a lot better than the 200-600 lens I found. So again, getting that low angle of view. So again, I can render the background completely out of focus. This does require that I lie belly down on the beach in order to get these types of shots. And this is actually quite comfortable when holding one of these 400-800 lenses, because I can put my elbow on the sand and support the weight of the lens. So I can hold the camera lens combination to my eye for a lot longer. 800mm, again, great detail that this is lens is highlighting with this particular shot. 800mm again, beautiful shallow depth of field, again with these type of shots. And close focusing, can't even get the entire head, now in at 800mm. So some beautiful tight shots, and this is what I really love. I do like getting as physically close as I can get to the wildlife and then filling the frame, and I don't even mind cutting into the top of the head. So we just focus in on the eyes there, no background in that previous shot. Let's take a look at focusing speed now. So now my test for pretty much all of the telephoto zooms that when I get delivery of them from Sony is I'm looking for something that's rapidly coming towards the camera. So the lens elements are having to move as fast as possible. If we're looking at something that's tracking from left to right or right to left, the skills really are in the skills of the photographer being able to pan accurately. But when the subject matter is coming towards the camera very rapidly, then we're looking at the performance capabilities of the lens. And one of the things I was also keen to check is, can I zoom the lens during one of the bursts of shooting and maintain accurate autofocus? And the answer to that is yes. So here is this particular dog running at 800mm. The dog has turned and started running towards me, and we're starting to zoom out now, and it's the same run, it's the same sequence, but I'm zooming out from 800 to 689mm because I don't want to lose the dog in the frame. I want to be able to contain all of the the subject in the frame. So now we're down to 538 millimeters, and it hasn't missed a beat. There's not a single shot where the eyes are not sharp in this sequence of images. And tested this over and over again with different dogs, and reliably hanging on to focus even when zooming. Rapid focus at close range really tests the capabilities of the lens as well. The closer the subject gets to the lenses, the more the lens elements are having to move, and so those focus motors have to be able to move those lens elements really quite rapidly to achieve a continuous burst where all images in the sequence are going to be sharp. I didn't have any issues with birds in flight with these particular shots. This one's actually coming towards me, or 3/4 angle, and this one is uncropped, so very close, and looking at zoom 509 millimeters, and it's still pulling focus really quite accurately, as you can see from the fit-in screen view here. Looking at the bird doesn't even fit in the frame now, and so rapid autofocus, zoomed into 100%, and yes, again the camera and lens combination has nailed the focus. Lens choice. I'm not going to say this is the best choice of lens, telephoto lens for everyone. Some people, it just isn't going to be the right lens for everyone. And the factors you have to put into that decision-making process is how much reach do you actually need? What is the maximum aperture you're prepared to work with? What is the maximum size and weight of the lens that you're prepared to work with? And also, how much budget do you have to spend on these lenses? As I did say, the maximum aperture of f5.6 at 800 millimeters can be achieved with those 400 or 600 G Master primes, but at significant price, and that budget is not going to be available to all photographers. So the 400-800 is a good choice, especially if you like filling the frame with your subject, or you're working with smaller wildlife such as small birds. This is going to be an attractive lens if you're not put off by the weight. There isn't one specific lens that you have to say. You can only shoot birds in flight if you have a lens with this particular focal length, because I've been photographing birds now for quite a while, and I've managed to shoot them with focal lengths as short as 85 millimeters. So here's a bowerbird captured with my 85mm f1.8 lens at f1.8. It did require that I sit there for half an hour waiting for the bird to come back and then not move a muscle because I am so close. But if that's something that you're prepared to do, play the waiting game by a nest, or you know where birds particularly land on a branch in a tree, and then just motionless, then you can work with quite short focal length lenses. Now, I've worked with my 135 f1.8 G Master inside a rainforest. Having a very long telephoto lens sometimes doesn't work for you because there's usually trees in between you and the wildlife. So if you are going to see any wildlife in the rainforest, it's typically going to land on a tree quite near to where you're standing. And so my 135 f1.8 lens is an excellent rainforest lens to photograph birds in. 300 millimeters with my f2.8 G Master is my absolute favorite if I can close the gap. And so here we're working with f2.8 at ISO 2000. Now, if I'd been working, maybe shooting this with the 400-800 at 400, and then the ISO is going to be considerably higher. Would I notice it after applying the denoising technologies? I'm not so sure many people would notice the difference. But I have to say that 300mm, I do like closing the gap, and sometimes I will photograph in a sanctuary rather than just trusting to birds flying in the wild. So I can get quite close and work with these f2.8 apertures. It's something that I actually like to do. 300mm at the maximum f2.8 aperture, especially when working in darker forests. So my personal recommendations for perhaps what is the best telephoto lens to work with is between that 200-600 coverage. I will use a 70-200, but then beyond 200 I tend to use that 200-600 coverage using a 300 f2.8 G Masters and 1.4 and 2 times teleconverters. That is the combination that I'm currently working with, in preference to the 100-400 and in preference to the 200-600. For focal lengths above and beyond 600 millimeters, this is perhaps where it gets more interesting, because with the new 400 to 800 lens, we've got capabilities of covering that 600 to 1600 millimeter range if we start using teleconverters on this lens. And so this is going to be attractive to some photographers who just simply can't get good and close to their wildlife, and they can reliably get good atmospheric conditions in order to facilitate absolutely very sharp images at these longer focal length lenses. If you found this review useful, just head over to patreon.com/Mark Gaylor. I have Q&A forums which I can support any of your questions. I have 1 and 2 hour seminars on a whole range of photographic topics, and I have camera setup files that will set up your camera, and they'll set up your camera as outlined in my 500, 600, 700 page ebooks, and I've covered most of the late model cameras since the Alpha 7.3 way back when, and so I should have the ebook that supports your particular camera. So thumbs up if you've enjoyed this 400-600 lens review, and I'll catch you online next time.